They vanished on a freezing Chicago night in 1989. A family of 4 who should have made it home but never did. No crash, no wreckage, no trace. Just silence on the streets where their car was last seen. For decades, the case was treated as one more unsolved disappearance in a city that knew too many of them. But hidden in the shadows, the truth was far darker. Because this family wasn't lost to chance. They were targeted. Imagine a father who worked long hours at a local bank, a mother who walked her children to school each morning, neighbors who waved at them on the porch. Then picture the porch light left on for years, meals uneaten, photos fading on the wall. What would you believe if it was your street, your family, your city? This story begins as a mystery, a disappearance swallowed by time. But as the years pass, clues emerge that point not to accident or fate, but to a calculated act by people who lived outside the law. The family's vanishing wasn't random. It was part of something bigger, a puzzle piece in a criminal plan that reached far beyond their quiet neighborhood. If this happened in your town, what would you believe? Comment your country below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the cases that refuse to stay buried. Because what begins as a missing persons case in 1989 ends with the shocking discovery that it was never about a disappearance at all. You imagine Chicago in the winter of 1989, the kind of cold that turns the city into glass. Streets shine slick under sodium lamps, steam hisses from manhole covers, and everyone moves a little faster, their breath rising like ghosts. On one of those nights, the Patterson family left their modest brick home on the south side. A father, a mother, and 2 children bundled in coats. They were headed out to dinner with friends, nothing unusual, just another Friday night in the city. Neighbors watched them leave. Some waved. The family car, a pale blue sedan, pulled away from the curb and vanished into traffic. It should have been a simple evening. A meal, some laughter, a drive home. But they never came back. When midnight passed and the house stayed dark, friends started calling. By morning the worry had turned heavy. The police were notified and soon the Pattersons were listed as missing. At first it seemed like another tragic accident. Chicago winters were unforgiving. Cars skidded off roads, frozen ditches. The river claimed more than a few. But as search crews combed highways and canals, no wreckage appeared. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. The police canvassed the neighborhood. Witnesses said they saw the car heading west, past the old freight yards toward an area known less for family dinners and more for crime. Some shrugged it off as bad memory. Others insisted. Investigators traced the route but found nothing. No car, no tracks, no bodies. But the shocking part comes next. The family wasn't just gone. They had been erased. In the following weeks, detectives learned that Michael Patterson, the father, had recently taken a new position at a downtown bank. A promotion, small but steady, giving him access to more sensitive accounts. On its face, it was nothing unusual. But in Chicago in the late 80s, banks weren't just banks. They were vaults threaded through with shadows. Money laundering, shell accounts, quiet transactions that kept the underworld moving. No one wanted to say it out loud, but whispers spread fast. If the Pattersons had vanished, maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe it was business. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. Weeks turned to months. The family's house remained empty, snow piling on the porch, mail spilling from the slot. A single light was left burning in the hallway, a beacon that turned eerie the longer it stayed on. Friends left casseroles on the step long after hope had drained away. The city moved forward as cities do, but the case lingered in files marked unresolved. For the children's grandparents, it never ended. They called the police every month, begged for updates, sat in rooms where detectives avoided their eyes. For them, the silence was louder than any gunshot. But the shocking part comes next. 25 years later, in 2014, a new task force reopened cold cases from the South Side. Technology had changed. Databases had grown. What was once rumor could now be tested. The Patterson case was pulled from the shelf, its pages yellow, photographs faded. The first break came not from evidence bags, but from a man already behind bars. A former gang member serving time on weapons charges claimed he had information about a family that disappeared in '89. Detectives listened, skeptical, until he mentioned the blue sedan. Then they leaned closer. He said the Pattersons hadn't just vanished, they had been taken. Not by strangers, not by fate, but by men who needed them gone. He claimed the father had seen something at the bank he wasn't supposed to. That his disappearance was payment, silence forced at gunpoint. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. Detectives pressed the inmate for details. He refused at first, then spoke in riddles.
"Check the yards," he said.
Not the trains, the ground beneath. When asked to explain, he only smiled. "You'll see." Investigators combed through old records of the freight yards near where the car was last seen. The area had changed. Warehouses demolished, new buildings rising, but foundations remained. And when they dug deeper into property records, they found something strange. A warehouse abandoned since the early '90s with no official history before that. No paperwork. No permits. Just a shell on paper, like it had been created to exist without existing. But the shocking part comes next. When police obtained a warrant and broke through the padlocked doors of the warehouse, the dust told one story. No one had been there for years. But in the far corner beneath rotting tarps, they found it. The pale blue sedan. Rusted, stripped, but unmistakable. The Pattersons' car. Inside, the seats were torn. The dashboard was cracked, and on the passenger seat lay something that froze the room. A child's mitten, red wool, small enough to fit in a palm. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The car was towed for forensic analysis. Though time had eaten away much of it, traces remained. Fibers, stains, signs of struggle. It was no accident. The Pattersons had made it this far before being stopped, and someone had made sure they went no further. Detectives now faced a new reality. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a crime scene buried for decades, and if the car was here, hidden in plain sight, who had kept it that way? They dug into old organized crime files, cross-referencing bank records, gang movements, syndicate names whispered in wiretaps from the late '80s. Patterns emerged. Accounts moved through the bank where Michael Patterson worked. Accounts that fed into shell companies laundering millions. The conclusion was unavoidable. Michael hadn't just stumbled into promotion. He had stumbled into a machine that didn't allow mistakes. And when he saw too much, his family became collateral. But the shocking part comes next. For among the papers buried in the warehouse office, investigators found a torn ledger. The ink was faded, the pages brittle, but one line stood out. A list of initials, dates, and amounts. And scrawled beside one date in December 1989 were 4 letters. PATS. Detectives stared at the page, silence thick. It wasn't just rumor. The Pattersons had been logged. An entry in a ledger of lives silenced to keep money moving. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. The discovery reignited the case. Families demanded answers. Reporters dug into archives, pulling grainy photos of the smiling Pattersons at block parties, children holding sparklers on the 4th of July. The city asked the question no one wanted. How many more names in that ledger were hidden beneath unsolved cases? The chapter closes with the detective holding the mitten, its red wool frayed but still vivid, whispering, "They weren't lost. They were taken." And you're left asking, if a family's disappearance could be buried for 25 years to protect a crime syndicate, how many other vanishings were never accidents at all? You picture the city in 2014, buzzing with change but haunted by old shadows. Chicago's skyline gleamed taller, but the South Side still carried scars. Empty lots where homes once stood, warehouses crumbling like broken teeth. And somewhere in those ruins, The truth about the Pattersons lingered. The blue sedan had cracked the case wide open, but it was only the beginning. Forensics confirmed what everyone feared. The blood traces inside the car belonged to Michael and his wife Ellen. The children's DNA wasn't found, but the mitten left no doubt. The family had been forced inside that warehouse, and something terrible had happened. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. Detectives revisited the man in prison, the one who had whispered about the yards. They pressed him harder. Why now? Why speak after decades of silence? He leaned back, his eyes glinting in the fluorescent light. Because they're all gone now, he said. The old crew, the bosses, the ones who made the call. Dead or locked up. It doesn't matter anymore. But back then, he trailed off, his grin turning sour. Back then, you didn't say no. But the shocking part comes next. He revealed that the Patterson disappearance was never random. Michael Patterson had been working late when he stumbled across transfers that didn't add up. Millions moved through ghost accounts, all tied to a shell company linked to a syndicate boss known only as Rico. Michael had asked questions. Too many. And in a city where questions were bullets. He signed his family's death warrant without even knowing it. Detectives pulled the old bank files, cross-referencing them against the ledger found in the warehouse. Numbers aligned. Michael had discovered the money trail, and for that he and his family were erased. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The investigation shifted from a missing persons case into a homicide tied to organized crime. FBI analysts pored over the evidence, connecting dots that once seemed invisible. Names emerged. Low-level operatives, bank clerks, enforcers, all part of a web designed to protect the flow of money. But the most chilling discovery wasn't who ordered the hit. It was why the family had been taken alive first. For weeks before their disappearance, Michael had confided to a co-worker that he felt watched. A car idling near his house, phone lines clicking when he picked up. At first, the co-worker dismissed it as paranoia. But now, reading old statements, detectives realized the syndicate had been circling him long before that night. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet, because one more piece of evidence waited in the shadows. During the warehouse search, an FBI tech discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was a small rusted lockbox. Inside the lockbox, photographs. Grainy Polaroid snapshots. Some showed the family's car parked outside their home. Others showed Michael entering the bank late at night. And the last one froze investigators cold. The children, sitting in the back seat of the sedan, wide-eyed, as if someone had taken the photo just before the car was driven into the warehouse. But the shocking part comes next. None of the photos had fingerprints. They were deliberate staged surveillance, which meant someone close, someone trusted, had been watching. Detectives turned their focus inward. Co-workers, neighbors, even friends of the family. Who had access to their lives? Who knew their routine so well that they could predict the exact night to strike? The answer came quietly, from a retired cop who'd worked Southside Patrol in the late 80s. He remembered a name. A young officer, later dismissed for misconduct, rumored to have ties to the syndicate. He had been the first responder to the Patterson disappearance, the one who filed the original missing persons report. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. Detectives tracked him down, now an old man living in Florida. When questioned, he denied involvement. But when shown the Polaroids, his hands trembled. "I never took those," he said. "But I know who did." His voice cracked as he gave them a name. A syndicate enforcer, long dead, but infamous in his time. Known for making people disappear. And then, the officer said something that stopped the room cold. The kids weren't supposed to die. They were supposed to be leverage. But the shocking part comes next. For the first time, investigators considered that maybe the children's fate hadn't ended in that warehouse. Maybe they had been held elsewhere. bargaining chips in a deal no one ever uncovered. FBI archives revealed that in early 1990, multiple informants had reported rumors of a family kept in the basements of Syndicate safe houses. No names, no proof, just whispers. At the time, the Bureau had dismissed it as paranoia. But now, with the car found and the photos unearthed, the whispers rang louder. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. Detectives visited the old neighborhoods, speaking to aging witnesses who had seen too much and said too little. One man, frail and half-blind, admitted he remembered children's voices behind a boarded house. They cried at night, he said. But then one day the crying stopped. The trail seemed endless, each lead dripping with despair. Yet every clue painted the same picture. The Pattersons hadn't simply vanished into thin air. They had been pulled into a world of crime that devoured innocence. But the shocking part comes next. As the case files grew, one pattern stood out. Every name connected to the disappearance eventually ended up dead. Shot in alleys, buried in fields, overdosed in cheap motels. It was as if the Syndicate had scrubbed history clean, leaving nothing but fear. The only survivors were those who had stayed silent. And then came the phone call. An anonymous voice, raspy and old, left a message on the detective's line. "You want the truth about 89? Look in the river." Click. The next morning, divers were sent into the murky waters south of the yards. Hours later, they surfaced with something metallic. A lockbox, corroded but intact. Inside were documents, bank slips, coded notes, and a single promissory letter signed by Michael Patterson. It was dated 2 days before the disappearance. In the letter, Michael wrote, "If anything happens to me or my family, it's because I found out the bank is not what it seems. Tell them to keep looking." Still, the real story hadn't even begun. For this letter, after all those years, confirmed what everyone feared but no one had said. The Pattersons hadn't been victims of random violence. They had been executed pawns in a billion-dollar crime machine. The chapter ends with the detective staring at the faded ink, whispering, "This was never just a disappearance. This was a message." And you're left asking, if one family could vanish to protect a syndicate's fortune, how many more names are buried beneath the city, waiting for the truth to surface? You picture the detective sitting alone in the precinct. The city's noise muffled by thick walls and thicker regret. On the table before him lies the letter signed by Michael Patterson. The ink is faded, the paper brittle, but the words cut sharp even after 25 years. "If anything happens to me or my family, it's because I found out the bank is not what it seems. Tell them to keep looking." He can't shake it. The words aren't just a warning. They're a confession. A breadcrumb deliberately left behind by a man who knew he was walking into a trap. And if Michael left this letter, then he must have realized how deep the shadows ran. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. The detective spreads out all the evidence, the photos, the ledger, the Polaroids, the bloody fibers from the sedan, the red mitten. Each piece whispers the same story. A family didn't vanish by accident. They were swallowed by something larger, something that didn't forgive mistakes. But the shocking part comes next. He finds himself tracing back the bank records again, staring at transfers that shifted through shell companies with surgical precision. Millions flowing from downtown accounts into offshore havens, then back again, laundered clean. And always in the middle, the faintest fingerprint of a syndicate known in whispers as the Outfit. Chicago had been its hunting ground for decades, and banks were their feeding trough. If Michael had stumbled onto this river of money, then the Outfit wouldn't have let him walk away. But why take his family too? Why make 4 people vanish instead of just one? The answer gnaws at him, because silence isn't enough. Fear has to echo. A family erased sends a louder message than a man buried alone. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The detective takes the evidence to the FBI. In a sterile conference room, Agents lean over photographs, their faces grim. They've seen syndicates bury secrets before, but never a family like this. One agent mutters, "This wasn't just to hide money. This was a chess move." But the shocking part comes next. When analysts cross-reference the ledger from the warehouse with bank records, a new name emerges. Not Michael Patterson, but his supervisor at the bank, a man named Robert Keene. Keene retired quietly in the mid-90s, moved to Arizona, and lived without scrutiny. But in the late 80s he signed off on the very accounts Michael flagged. The implication is terrifying. Michael wasn't the only one who knew. Keene knew too, but he didn't vanish. He prospered. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. Detectives fly to Arizona, knock on Keene's door, and find him frail, oxygen tank hissing, eyes clouded with age. At first he denies everything, but when shown the letter, his composure cracks. His voice trembles. "I told them not to touch the kids," he whispers. "I begged, but Rico," he said, "loose ends are loose ends." The name hangs in the air like smoke. Rico, the ghost behind the accounts, the man who had haunted Chicago's underworld for decades. A name spoken in alleys, never on paper. But the shocking part comes next. Keene admits something darker. He says Michael wasn't supposed to see the transfers. He was supposed to process them blindly, sign the forms, move the money. But he looked too close. And when Michael questioned him, Keene reported it up the chain, thinking it would end with intimidation. Instead, it ended with disappearance, and then, Keene says the words no one expected. They didn't die that night. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. According to Keene, the Pattersons were taken alive to a safe house near the freight yards. The plan was leveraged to hold them until Michael's silence was guaranteed. But something changed. Keene doesn't know what. All he knows is that after 2 weeks, the family was gone, and Rico told him the problem solved itself. Detectives leave Arizona shaken. If the family survived those first nights, then where did they go? Were they moved, killed, buried deeper in the city's underbelly? Back in Chicago, the case consumes the task force. They revisit old maps, tracing Syndicate safe houses marked in dusty FBI files. One building stands out, a former speakeasy turned flop house. Burned in the early 90s. Neighbors once reported screams at night, but no one investigated. But the shocking part comes next. When ground-penetrating radar scans the site, it reveals voids beneath the rubble, spaces that shouldn't exist. Digging begins, and within days searchers uncover a sealed basement chamber. Inside are rusted chairs bolted to the floor, chains dangling from the walls, and children's toys scattered in the dust. A doll, a yo-yo, a bent bicycle wheel. Still, the truth hadn't surfaced yet. Forensic teams move carefully, cataloging every artifact. Traces of DNA cling to the toys. They match the Patterson children. The basement was real. The family had been here, but no bodies are found. No remains. Just the echo of their presence, a prison that once held them but now stands empty. The discovery sends shockwaves. Families of other missing persons flood the police lines, demanding answers. Reporters swarm the site, snapping photos of the doll under harsh light. Headlines scream, "Missing Families Prison Found After 25 Years." But the shocking part comes next. A retired FBI agent contacts the task force, claiming he once worked undercover in the outfit. He says Rico had a reputation for moving people, not just money. They called it ghosting, he explains. If someone saw too much, you didn't just kill them. You made them vanish so completely it was like they never existed. Families, kids, anyone. Ghosted. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. He recalls a story of a farmhouse outside Joliet, used as a transfer point. People taken there were never seen again. But in his files he kept one photo, grainy black and white, of a family being escorted inside. The figures are blurry, but when magnified, the outline of two children clutching each other is unmistakable. Detectives stare at the photo, the hair on their necks rising. Could it be the Pattersons? The chapter ends with the detective pinning the photo on the board, the children's blurred faces staring back through time. His voice is low but steady. They weren't lost in '89, they were moved. And if they were moved, then somewhere, someone still knows where they went. And you're left asking, was the Patterson family executed long ago? Or are they the ghosts of a machine that still hides them even now? You picture the farmhouse before you ever see it, because in your mind it already exists. A box of weathered boards on a flat Illinois field, bare trees like ribs against a pewter sky, a gravel lane that remembers tires better than footsteps. When the detective and his team finally drive out past Joliet, every turn feels like a page being peeled back. The suburbs giving way to open land and the kind of quiet that suggests secrets don't vanish. They're planted. The address from the retired agent's photo doesn't match anything on modern maps, but property lines do. And the line they follow leads them to a raised foundation where a house should be and a chimney that rises from nothing. A red brick exclamation mark on the wrong sentence. For a long moment, nobody moves. Cold wind combs the grass. A hawk draws a slow circle overhead. The detective thinks of the blurred photo pinned to his board. Two small shapes, shoulder to shoulder, led through a doorway, and wonders if this foundation is the echo of that doorway, if the door itself ever closed. But wait, the shocking part comes next. They grid the site and set to work. Flags in fluorescent colors jabbed into soil, ground-penetrating radar dragged like a sled over dirt still frozen at the edges. The machine barks, hiccups, draws lines. At first it shows the expected voids, old cistern, septic, a collapsed root cellar. But then a long, smooth line appears where a line has no business being. A rectangle 9 feet by 12, buried at 6 feet, with a density that reads like poured concrete rather than stone. A slab, the text says. Someone capped something. They dig. The smell finds them before the truth does. Not decay. That long ago took its leave, but the mineral stink of damp and the sharp chemical rasp of old solvent. When the excavator's bucket kisses something flat and unyielding, they climb down by hand. 4 corners, chamfered, a lid. Bolt heads rounded off to resist wrenches. Whoever sealed this meant it to be permanent. The detective runs his gloved fingers along the edge and feels the line of a weld. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. A generator coughs to life. A torch spits blue. For hours they cut, the hiss of heated steel mixing with the hiss of wind through dry grass. When the final tongue of metal gives and the lid lists to one side, light pours into a darkness so complete it looks solid. The detective lowers his flashlight. Dust blooms luminous. The beam finds shelves built into poured walls, a cot frame bolted to the slab, a narrow desk with a chair that was never meant to be comfortable, and across one wall the marks that undo him, pencil lines at different heights with names you can read even after a quarter century. Mel, under it a date. Joey, under it a second date. Tick marks rising, then stopping. He realizes he has been holding his breath. He lets it out and it sounds like someone else. There are other things. A plastic yo-yo, string broken and wound like a nervous habit around the axle. A comb with missing teeth. The heel of a child's. Sneaker, worn to the nail on the right side. Someone who dragged their foot when tired. A paper chain made from torn magazine pages looped once around the cot, faded reds and blues like an old parade. He crouches by the desk and sees the 2 words that a child has written into the wood with something sharp, letter by letter, impatient and exact. Take me. But wait, the shocking part comes next. In the far corner, half buried in silt, a metal lunch pail lies on its side. Inside, in a Ziploc bag gone opaque and greasy with time, is a microcassette. The detective cups it in both hands as if it can feel his fingers. The label on its cracked plastic reads simply, Ellen, 2. He thinks of the red mitten in the sedan, of porches left lit through winters that were not kind, of a woman who walked her children to school every morning and probably said things like shoes, hats, lunch, love you. He doesn't let anyone else carry the tape. He doesn't let it out of his sight. At the mobile lab, the machine is older than most of the team but newer than the tape. A tech wipes the heads with alcohol, murmurs something that sounds like a prayer, and presses play. At first there's only hiss, a surf of static, and the irregular clack of a machine someone doesn't know how to use. Then a voice threads through, near and thin, a woman measuring her breath between words. If someone finds this, she says, and the detective's spine goes cold because he hears the shape of determination inside the shape of fear. Tell my mother I kept the kids warm. Tell Michael we waited. There's a scrape, something set down hard near the mic, someone shushing someone, and then the same voice gets closer as if she has pressed her mouth to the grill. He says if Michael signs we go, she whispers. He says the bank will be unclean. She laughs. A sound made of a person losing and winning the same argument. It's never clean. A child's voice breaks in, high, urgent, impossible, and says something about stars drawn on a wall. The tape clacks. The tech reaches to steady the speed. Ellen's voice returns. Friday. He said Friday after close. Halstead Bridge. If anyone hears this, if anyone. The rest is shredded by a smack, a man's voice in a register that makes everyone in the lab look down, and then the tape runs to air. Still, the real story hasn't even begun. Halstead Bridge is not poetry. It is steel, rivets, grit, the way Chicago spans water and regret. The detective sends divers to the piers where scrub and trash and rumor collect. Currents here are the color of old pennies and move like mood. Hours pass. A hook catches something wrapped. They bring up a steel canister, the kind used to shuttle documents in pneumatic tubes in banks that still had brass like a religion. Stamped on the side, beneath river muck, a familiar downtown bank's logo. The tech with nimble hands takes a Dremel to the corroded latch. Inside, paper that survived because the river denied itself, because someone sealed it too well. A schedule, a schematic, a bidding card that maps a master key in numbers that only a locksmith reads like scripture. The detective spreads the pages across a table and the plan reveals itself without shame. An end-of-week vault cycle, a refrigeration unit that triggers a timed bypass, the way a back door becomes a front if you know when the guard likes coffee. But wait, the shocking part comes next. The dates on the schedule line up not with the night the Pattersons vanished, but 2 weeks later. The same 2 weeks the retired banker said the family was kept alive. 2 Fridays after the disappearance, that vault was robbed in a way that looked like failure and felt like theater. The official story blamed a hardware glitch. Insurance paid. Newspapers moved on. What nobody realized, what nobody was supposed to realize, was that the theft covered a second theft. Not bearer bonds and cash, but ledger microfilms detailing the shell routes. Hide the crime by staging a louder one. And you understand, with a sourness you taste in your throat, why a family needed to be alive until a second Friday. Call it leverage. Call it obedience. Call it the sound a city makes when it pretends money isn't a person. They search the rest of the pit. A second microcassette turns up near the slab wall under a fold of plastic, with a different voice. Male, low, annoyed by the existence of microphones. Tell Rico the kids are fine, it says. The man won't sign. He keeps saying, call the feds. Take the mother next, he'll sign. The tape stops. Air fights for space in the lab. Someone says a word that isn't for reports. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. Because an old crime never stays alone. It drags its friends. A neighbor, who kept film reels in a shoebox, he liked to start his camcorder whenever headlights cut the lane, shows the detective a video of a night in January 1990 when 3 vehicles idled without lights by the farmhouse that no longer exists. The picture judders, focus fighting a fog, but the shapes are there. A van with sliding door, a box truck with a dent on the rear quarter, a sedan you have seen before in your mind. The camera lurches when a man in a coat looks directly into it 3 houses away through trees and lifts a hand as if to wave or warn. The plate on the box truck, when stabilized and blessed by software that makes ghosts stand still, traces to a logistics LLC that dissolved in 1991. The man who incorporated it once shared an address with Robert Keene's brother-in-law. That file is going to make someone's phone ring. You ask yourself the question that the detective asks without moving his mouth. If a system reaches into a kitchen and cancels a family to keep a vault on schedule, what else did it purchase with their fear? But the shocking part comes next. While the team is still cataloging the pit, a clerk doing the ordinary miracle of cross-checking turns up a bill paid in cash every quarter since 1990 on a storage unit in a facility slung up against the canal. The person on the lease never shows in person. An envelope arrives with 20s and a P.O. box return. The unit smells like rubber, old tape, aftershave. On the shelves. Things that look like evidence collected by someone who doesn't trust cops. Blue binders with bank printouts. A pair of latex gloves fused to themselves by time. Polaroids of doors and faces and the backs of necks. In a shoebox labeled 290 sits a child's bracelet with plastic beads. Letters spelling out Joey, strung and restrung until the pattern repeats wrong. Beneath the bracelet, a strip of photo booth images, 4 frames of a woman and 2 children making fish faces at a camera. The detective stares too long at the last frame where the woman doesn't smile, because she is looking at something outside the booth, outside the story, and he thinks that is how you can tell the truth from a myth. Someone is always looking at the thing no one else wants to see. In the back of the unit, taped under a shelf like the way you hide emergency money in a kitchen drawer, is a flat parcel wrapped in grocery bags and sealed with a thickness of duct tape that says fear moves through hands. Inside, a VHS tape with marker-scrawled letters, Airfry 2, and a motel towel embroidered with a name that belongs to a no longer standing place on Archer Avenue. The towel has 2 small dark stains that fluoresce for a moment when someone shines light. The machine says they are old blood. The tape rolls in a player you borrow from a school that hasn't updated its AV since 2003. Static eats a minute, then an image resolves. A basement you know because you stood in it. Pencil marks on a wall like parentheses around time. A cot with the paper chain thrown in a corner. The camera is set on a crate at waist height. A man with a blurred face puts a note card down in front of the lens. On it is written Halstead 11:30. He moves away. A woman comes into frame half a moment later. Hair pulled back with the kind of elastic you buy at a grocery store because you didn't plan to need it. She sits. 2 children sit beside her, one clutching a comb with missing teeth like a talisman. The woman looks into the lens with that particular courage some people find when there is nothing left to do but record a thing happening to them. She says, "We are the Pattersons." And you feel the detective's muscles make fists under his coat. "My husband will sign. Send this to..." She stops herself because she has almost said a name you can kill. "Send this to my mother," she says instead, and gives a street that used to be safe. A man shouts from off-screen. The woman flinches. The older child lifts their chin like a person 40 years from now, who has asked a question that matters. The tape dies when a hand drops over the lens, the smeared print's as personal as a kiss. Still, the real story hasn't even begun, because evidence, like grief, invites more of itself. A forensic accountant on the task force who never speaks above the volume of paper discovers that 2 days after the vault schedule in the canister, 3 cashier's checks moved through the bank in amounts small enough to pass below the detectors of the time. The payee on the second check is a shell that once paid the lease on the storage unit. The memo line on the third is blank except for 4 letters that look like someone wrote them while a car hit a pothole. Pats. The ledger page in the warehouse was not a rumor after all. It was a receipt. You feel the line stretch tight from Southside to Halstead to a farm foundation and back to a vault. The way a city's veins are not drawn on its tourist map, but you can find them anyway if you listen for the pulse. The detective, whose job it is to live in pulses, starts sleeping on a couch in the office again. He pins the towel, a photocopy of it, on the board, not because it will hold, but because leaving it in a box will break something in him that he cannot replace. But wait, the shocking part comes next. There's a match. It doesn't come from fingerprints or blood. It comes from the small, unselfish genius of public health. A DNA hit pings from a hospital in Gary, old sample. Never linked to a name because the patient checked out AMA and left an address that does not exist. The partial profile leans hard toward a Patterson child. The date in the hospital log is late 1996. 7 years after the disappearance. The intake note says laceration, left forearm, minor. The margin says child refused to say how. In the field labeled parent guardian, someone wrote mother, L, then scratched out the last letters hard enough to scar paper. The lab director calls the detective on a Saturday and speaks like someone who has pulled a live wire out of a wall. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. Because a lead is only a door you can't see the other side of. The hospital security tapes from that season were overwritten long ago. The nurse who signed the intake moved to Florida in 2003 and died in 2011. The urgent care since changed owners twice and now sells smoothies in the lobby. But the registrar, who was 22 in 1996 and is 60 now, remembers a woman with calm eyes who held her kid's hand like the hand was both a map and a destination. She said thank you 3 times, the registrar tells the detective. Nobody says it like that unless they don't expect to be allowed to say it. What do you do with a thank you from a decade you can't get back? They work the Gary angle hard. A motel night clerk who lasted less than a year behind that particular counter remembers a mother and 2 kids who checked in late, paid cash, left before sunrise. The clerk remembers because one of the kids asked if there were any rooms with windows that locked from the inside. The clerk laughed and said, "No, honey, that's not how windows work." 20 minutes later, he watched the mother shove a dresser against the window anyway. He did not tell anybody because you do not tell anybody. In a place where people fix their own problems. The detective drives back to the farmhouse, foundation at dusk, and sits on the hood of his car while stubble whispers and light goes thin. He thinks of a child standing at a motel window testing a latch with fingers that healed around a scar from a left forearm. He thinks of how fear changes shape but not size. He thinks of the word ghosting and hates it because it pretends a thing is elegant when it is only cruel. He goes back to the tunnel of his board. He lines the receipts in a row. He tapes the VHS still with the note card. He writes Halstead in letters too big, and then smaller because big felt like shouting and shouting felt like a mistake. He circles the date in 1996 and draws a second circle around it. He writes a question he never writes on the board because the board doesn't deserve it. But he writes it now because sometimes the only way to pull a story is to insult it. Why let them live? Paper answers in the only voice it has with another page. The old undercover agent, the one who gave them the farmhouse, produces a torn memo from a dusty folder. Typed header, outside services. Typed line item, holding, 4. Handwritten note in the margin in a hand like a rasp, Keep alive till Friday too. A second handwritten note beneath in a different pen. After. Move, no local, no parts. The detective stares at the word parts until it stops being a word. He looks away only when his partner says his name twice. They do not talk much after that. They make a list instead. The list tells them where to go next. They will check motels along the river, looking for room logs that survived, not because anyone cared, but because nobody cared enough to throw them away. They will pull traffic camera footage that never existed from cameras that didn't either. And they will try anyway because sometimes mercy lives in impossible asks. They will go back to the bank not for money but for the way the building learned to lie. They will find someone who delivered groceries to rural rooms paid for in cash. They will ask how many peanut butter sandwiches a child can eat when a mother can make only one thing without a stove. And the list ends with a place the detective writes last, because it feels like writing a dare. The river again, but not at Halstead, a bend miles south where current slows and a weir catches what the city does not admit it drops. There is a rumor that a thing wrapped in motel towels sank there and never came back. There is a rumor that tow lines have broken on it twice, and a man who swore never to talk carried that fact around like a broken tooth. The chapter closes with the detective standing at that bend in the river in the last light, the surface dull and heavy as pewter, a rope coiled at his feet, a crane truck idling like a patient animal behind him. He touches the microcassette in his pocket, the way a believer touches a relic and says aloud, to the water and to the city and to anyone who cares to listen. Friday wasn't the end. The rope snakes out and tightens. Something down there answers with wait, and you're left asking when the river finally gives back what it was paid to keep. Will it be a body, a truth, or a plan that proves the Pattersons were never meant to vanish? They were meant to be used? You imagine the river giving back what it was never supposed to return. The crane hauls the rope taut, gears grinding, water spilling in arcs. Onlookers crowd the bank, some with notepads, others with eyes that say they're here for ghosts. The surface breaks with a slick cough and the weight comes up, a steel drum, dented and sealed, painted black long before rust claimed it. It turns slowly as if reluctant, dripping silt that smells like secrets. The detective stands at the edge, coat heavy with mist. His breath clouds as the drum thuds onto mud. He doesn't move until a crowbar clinks against the lid. The seal groans, metal peels, and the inside exhales a breath kept too long. Everyone leans closer. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. Inside are bundles of papers wrapped in oilcloth, bones of a plan meant never to see daylight. The cloth falls apart at a touch, revealing account ledgers with names, sums, dates. But mixed among the pages are things that don't belong in banks. A photograph of Ellen Patterson, unsmiling, hair pulled back, eyes fixed on the camera like she knows it's the last time. Another photo shows the children, older than in the VHS stills, aged by maybe a year, maybe two, standing in a dim room with bare walls. They look directly into the lens, but wait. The shocking part comes next. Behind the papers lies another cassette, this one larger, a reel-to-reel wound with tape dark as night. The detective holds it with care, the way you'd carry a pulse. Back at the lab, machines older than the interns coax sound from it. Static rushes, then voices emerge. Men speaking low, laughing between threats. One says, "Keep the kids quiet." Another says, "Friday it ends." Then silence broken by a woman's sob. The detective recognizes Ellen's voice. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The task force pieces it together. The family wasn't killed immediately. They were bargaining chips. Pawns moved to ensure Michael Patterson's silence while the outfit prepared its second robbery. And when the job was done, when money was moved and ledgers were stolen, the family became weight, not people. Weight, but not all of them. The hospital record from Gary lingers like a whisper. A child treated for a cut, discharged without a trace. The registrar's memory of a mother saying thank you 3 times. It doesn't fit the story of a family executed. It suggests survival, escape, Or perhaps a trade no one dared record. But the shocking part comes next. A retired FBI wiretap specialist digs through dusty boxes and finds tapes from 1997, recorded during surveillance of an outfit lieutenant. The tape captures him muttering after a long night, drunk and careless. "She's still out there," he says. "Took the brats with her. Rico says leave it. Better ghosts than graves." The room freezes. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. If Ellen Patterson escaped, where did she go? How did she live unseen, unregistered, unremarked for years? The detective spreads maps across his desk, pins motel names, safe houses, the arc of highways between Chicago and Gary. A pattern forms, faint but insistent. Ellen's path was a circle, not a line. She stayed close, orbiting the city that betrayed her, never more than 50 miles away, as if waiting, as if watching. But the shocking part comes next. The detective returns to the storage unit. He studies every photo again, this time with fresh eyes. In one Polaroid, behind a blurred figure, a calendar hangs crooked on a wall. The date circled in red isn't 1990, it's 1994. The implication rattles the board off its nails. The family, or at least part of it, lived years longer than anyone believed. Hidden, moved, alive. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. He drives to the farmhouse ruins again. At dusk, mist crawls from the ground like the earth breathing. He kneels where the cot once stood, where the pencil marks still rise like stunted prayers. He whispers their names into the empty air. Michael, Ellen, Joey, Mel. The silence answers with its own kind of weight. And then he sees it, etched deeper into the wall than the children's names hidden beneath grime. Letters scratched with something sharp. "We were here." The chapter closes on the detective's face lit by his flashlight, staring at those words. And you're left asking, if the Pattersons lived beyond 1989, who helped them survive? And who decided their silence was more valuable than their lives? You imagine the words "we were here" etched into the farmhouse wall, burning into the detective's mind. Long after he leaves the site, they're not graffiti, they're not vandalism. They're testimony, a family shouting across time with what little strength they had left. And if those words exist, then maybe more traces are waiting, buried, boxed, or still breathing somewhere in the city's maze of shadows. The next days blur into sleepless nights. Case files spread across desks, Polaroids pinned edge to edge, motel receipts stacked in uneven towers. The detective traces every lead with a desperation that borders on obsession. A coffee stain on a receipt becomes a map. A phone number scrawled on a ledger margin becomes a cipher. He feels Ellen Patterson whispering through every page, "We were here. Keep looking." Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. The task force requests federal subpoenas, pulling records from long-shuttered banks and warehouses. One box contains surveillance photos from the early 90s, grainy shots of men entering and leaving a downtown club known to be a Syndicate hangout. At first glance, nothing unusual. But in the background of one photo, the detective sees something he can't ignore. A woman, thin, hair tied back, walking two children across the street. Faces blurred, but the height, the build, the posture. They echo the Patterson family like a ghost wearing skin. But the shocking part comes next. The club itself burned down in 1995, long before the photo was ever revisited. But the storage lot next to it still exists. The detective drives there, gravel crunching under his tires, wind rattling the chain-link fence. A rusted shed leans like a drunk against the fence line. Inside, under a pile of rotting tarps, he finds a trunk. Dust cakes the lock, but the hinges snap under force. Inside, children's clothing, late 80s style. A sweater with Joey stitched in yarn by a mother's hand. A pair of pink barrettes. A Polaroid of Ellen in profile, sitting at a table in a dim room. The date scrawled at the bottom, March 1991, still. The real story hadn't even begun. The photo confirms what the detective feared and hoped at once. The family survived the initial disappearance. They were moved, hidden, used, which means their story stretches further than anyone imagined. He presents the photo to the grandparents, now in their 80s. Their hands tremble as they hold the image. The grandmother whispers, "She kept them alive." Tears soak into the photo's edge, staining it with grief that time never drained. But the shocking part comes next. A new tip surfaces, anonymous, like so many before. The caller says he once drove for Rico, back when the outfit's power ran like electricity through Chicago's alleys. He remembers moving packages from one safe house to another. He remembers a woman and children kept under guard. They were leverage, he says, voice cracking. But leverage for what, I don't know. One night I came back and they were gone. Just gone, the detective presses him. Gone how? Were they killed? Moved, sold? The caller breathes hard, then whispers, "If you want answers, look under Bridgeport." Not the bridge. The tunnels, the line goes dead. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. Bridgeport has always been Chicago's underground heart. A warren of old bootlegger tunnels, drainage shafts, and forgotten basements that connect like veins. The detective and his team map out what they can, but most records are lost or falsified. They find one shaft still accessible, behind a bricked-up wall in a warehouse scheduled for demolition. They break through. Cold air spills out, thick with mold and damp stone. Their lights sweep across walls scrawled with gang tags, old furniture, and the skeletal remains of crates once used to smuggle liquor. And deeper still, a door, steel, rusted but unmistakably reinforced. But the shocking part comes next. When they force it open, the smell hits them. Metal, mildew, something older. Inside is a room lined with cots, bolted in rows. Chains dangle from the wall, some snapped, others intact, and at the far end a chalkboard still leans against the wall. Across it, in faded chalk, 3 words. "We were here. Again." Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The room is catalogued, photographed, sealed. But the chalkboard gnaws at the detective. He crouches, running a finger across the faint letters. The chalk smears, but another line hides beneath, written over, erased but not forgotten. Under UV light, the words reveal themselves. Friday 2. The same phrase from the VHS tape. The circle closes. Friday wasn't just a deadline for the vault robbery. It was a cycle, a ritual, a code embedded into every step of the Patterson's ordeal. Each Friday marked a decision. Move them, hold them, kill them. And at least twice someone chose to move them. But the shocking part comes next. Among the debris, a file folder survives, wrapped in plastic. Inside are handwritten notes, schedules, initials. One page lists EP beside dates stretching into 1993. Ellen Patterson lived. At least until then. The detective feels his pulse hammer. The grandmother's words echo. She kept them alive still. The truth hasn't surfaced yet. The notes mention another location. Canal South, Storage 41. It's an address near the industrial district. A row of units abandoned in the late 90s. The task force descends at dawn. Bolt cutters snap chains, doors screech open. Most units are empty. But in 41, behind crates of rusted machinery, they find a trunk sealed with duct tape. Inside are dozens of Polaroids. Children in dim rooms, always unsmiling. A woman seated beside them. Thinner each time, her eyes still sharp. Dates stretch across 5 years. The last photo, dated 1994, shows only the children. Ellen is gone. But the shocking part comes next. Pinned to the bottom of the trunk is a note card in shaky handwriting. Keep them until the deal is done. Rico's orders. No signatures, no names, just orders carried out like scripture. The detective stares at the last Polaroid. The children are older, maybe 9 and 12. Alive. Still alive in 1994. Which means the river. The drums, the graves, they weren't their end. Still, The real story hadn't even begun. The chapter closes with the detective holding the final Polaroid under the harsh light of the evidence room. The children stare back at him, trapped in a moment 20 years gone, their faces blurred by time but their eyes sharp as glass. And you're left asking, if the Pattersons' children lived into the 90s, who decided they had to disappear again? And is someone still alive who knows where they finally went? You imagine the detective's hands trembling as he lays the Polaroids across the table in a careful line. One by one, they tell a story nobody was supposed to hear. A timeline of captivity carved out of years. 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, and then finally 1994. The children age in still frames, their faces hollowing, their shoulders sharpening, but their eyes, they never lose that raw, desperate shine. In each photograph, Ellen sits with them until she disappears from the frame. Her absence in the final set is louder than any scream. The task force leans over the images in silence. No one needs to say the obvious. Ellen likely died in captivity, or she was separated and buried in some ledger as another erased name. But the children, Joey and Mel, survived longer than anyone ever dared imagine. The detective feels both hope and dread coursing through him because survival is not freedom. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. They take the photographs to the grandparents. Fragile fingers trace the images, trembling over each date. The grandmother breaks into sobs, whispering, "They grew." It's a cruel gift, proof that her grandchildren lived beyond the night of their disappearance. But the cruelty cuts deeper because the last Polaroid stops the clock abruptly. 1994, and then silence. But wait, the shocking part comes next. An evidence tech dusts the Polaroids for prints, not expecting much after decades. Most come up smudged, but one print, faint and partial, matches a known Syndicate enforcer from the 90s, Vincent Vito Morelli. A man long believed to be Rico's right hand. Morelli disappeared in 1995, his body never found. Rumor claimed he crossed the boss. Others said he knew too much. Now the detective wonders, did Morelli's disappearance tie back to the children? Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The team digs into old FBI wiretaps, recordings dusty and forgotten. On one tape, Morelli is heard arguing with another enforcer. His words crackle through static. "Kids ain't part of this. We're not animals." The other voice snaps back. "You think Rico cares? They're leverage. Nothing else." The tape ends with a thud as if someone slammed a receiver down. The detective plays it over and over. Morelli's protest stands out. Could he have tried to help them? Was his disappearance punishment for disobedience? But the shocking part comes next. A new source emerges. A retired Chicago cop with a history too checkered to ignore. He meets the detective in a diner, eyes darting, coffee untouched. "You're looking for ghosts," he says, voice low. "But ghosts leave footprints if you know where to look." He pulls out a folded sheet of paper, edges brittle. On it is an address. A safe house in Cicero demolished in the late 90s. "They kept them there after 93, the cop says. "I saw 'em. The kid's alive." The detective's pulse hammers. He demands proof. The cop only shrugs. "Proof is gone. All I got is memory. And guilt." Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. They dig through city archives and find demolition permits for the Cicero house. But attached to the file is an odd note. "Foundation sealed. Authorized by contractor M. Russo." Russo is a name tied directly to Rico's construction front. The house wasn't just demolished. It was buried deliberately. The team descends on the site, now an empty lot choked with weeds and trash. Ground-penetrating radar hums again, and beneath the soil a rectangular void emerges. They dig, hands dirty, adrenaline sharp, and what they find makes the air stop. But the shocking part comes next. A hidden basement, its concrete walls scorched with fire damage. Inside, rusted bed frames, rotted mattresses, and drawings on the walls. Childlike sketches in crayon. 2 stick figures holding hands. A house with a sun above it. And beneath them, written in shaky letters, Joey plus Mel. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The detective crouches by the wall, fingers tracing the waxy lines of melted crayon. It's proof undeniable. The children lived here. They had hope even in hell. But no bones, no remains, no sign of death, only absence, thick and suffocating. Among the rubble they find something else. A diary, its cover scorched, pages half-burned. The first entries are nonsense, words smeared by smoke and time. But one line survives, scrawled in a child's uneven hand. Mom said Friday we'll go home. The detective feels his chest tighten. Friday again. Always Friday. A cycle of false promises broken over and over. But the shocking part comes next. The diary's final page is signed not with words, but with a handprint in ash. Small, fragile, pressed hard enough to leave ridges. The detective stares until his vision blurs. The handprint says more than words ever could. I was here. I existed. Don't forget me, still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. The discovery reignites the city. Headlines scream of the ghost children of Cicero. Families of other missing persons gather outside the precinct, begging investigators to reopen their cases. The detective can't meet their eyes. He knows for every Patterson story there are dozens buried under dust and silence. But he can't stop. He tracks down the last living members of Rico's crew, men in nursing homes with oxygen tubes and cataracts. Most deny everything. One, frail and half-lost to dementia, mutters, "The kids, they went south. That's all I know. Rico sent them south. A word heavy with possibility. South of the city? South to another state? Or south into the ground?" But the shocking part comes next. The detective pores over transport records from 1994. One shipment stands out, a sealed truck, labeled as medical supplies routed from Cicero to a warehouse in Joliet. The company no longer exists, its records wiped. But a single faded invoice remains, signed with initials that match Vincent Morelli. Did Morelli try to move the children? Did he spirit them away under the guise of Syndicate orders? If so, did they escape his grasp or did Rico find out? Still, the real story hadn't even begun. The detective follows the Joliet lead. The warehouse is gone, replaced by a strip mall. But construction workers remember oddities during the demolition. A bricked-up room sealed and empty, and carved into one brick, faint but legible, a single word, help. The chapter closes with the detective staring at that brick, fingers tracing grooves carved by desperate hands, whispering, "They lived longer than we knew, but how long did hope last?" And you're left asking, if the children were moved again and again, always promised Friday, who finally decided their last Friday had come, and where does their trail end? You picture the brick with the word help carved into it like a whisper trapped in stone. The detective holds it in his hands long after the construction crew has gone. The grooves are shallow, jagged, desperate. It's not just a plea. It's a timeline. Proof that at least one Patterson child survived into the Joliet years, long after everyone believed they had been silenced. But still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. The task force dives into Joliet records, clawing through storage receipts, trucking logs, anything that might connect. They find traces of shell companies, one dissolved after the mid-90s, another rebranded into oblivion. Each paper trail ends in ash. Yet one receipt stands out. A purchase order for industrial freezers, billed to a warehouse front 2 blocks from the Help brick site. Freezers not for food, but for preservation. The detective feels bile rise. What did they preserve? Evidence or lives suspended too long? But wait, the shocking part comes next. Inside that same warehouse's demolition files, a foreman's note survives. South wall sealed, unopened. Do not touch per inspector order. The inspector's name matches a man later indicted for mob ties. Another thread. Another cover-up. The team reopens the rubble site, jackhammers biting through concrete. Dust fills the air, choking lungs and eyes. And then the hammer rings against hollow space. They clear debris, revealing a sealed chamber, walls thick, lined with steel. When the torch cuts it open, the stale air inside rushes out like an exhale held for decades. Still, the real story hadn't even begun. Inside the chamber are rows of lockers, numbered crudely with paint. Most are empty, but in the corner one locker remains locked shut. The metal is thin, corroded, easy to bend. When it gives, the door creaks open to reveal artifacts that freeze the detective's blood. A child's denim jacket, sleeve torn at the elbow. A lunchbox with fading cartoon characters, and taped to the inside wall, yellowed paper with words scrawled in a child's hand. Friday, he said, we go home. We wait. The detective's chest tightens. Friday again. Always Friday. A promise never meant to be kept. But the shocking part comes next. Behind the locker, hidden in a small recess, lies a cassette recorder. Batteries corroded, tape half chewed by time. They send it to the lab, coax sound from the damaged reels, static crackles, then faintly voices. Ellen, strained but steady. This is Ellen Patterson. If anyone hears this, my children are still alive. Please. A thud cuts her off. A man's voice curses. The tape warps, then resumes with a child's voice, high and frightened. Don't forget us. Then silence. The lab falls quiet. Even the machines seem to stop breathing. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. The discovery reignites the city once more. Media swarms. Old faces from the neighborhood appear, claiming to have seen glimpses of children in places they never should have been. Some swear they remember Ellen in Joliet. Others insist they saw two kids at a gas station in Indiana, eyes hollow, escorted by men in suits. But memories bend with time. Truth is buried under layers of rumor. The detective knows better than to trust noise. He turns instead to money. Following the cash leads him to a ledger fragment tucked in old IRS archives. It lists payouts, small, regular, coded only with initials. Next to the date June 1994 EP 200. Another entry. Later that year, J+M, proof. That Ellen and the children weren't just captives, they were line items in a syndicate's budget. But the shocking part comes next. The entries end abruptly in late 1994. After that, no payouts, no initials, no trace. The ledger falls silent, as if the family was erased not only in flesh, but in accounting still. The real story hadn't even begun. The detective returns to the grandparents with the denim jacket, preserved and catalogued. The grandmother presses it to her face, inhaling fabric stiff with dust, whispering, "This was Joey's." Her voice cracks as she rocks in her chair, as if holding the child himself. The grandfather, silent for years, finally speaks. If they lived that long, why couldn't they come home? The detective has no answer, but the shocking part comes next. One final tip arrives, anonymous like so many before. A voice distorted, cautious, perhaps synthetic. The children didn't die in Joliet, it says. They were moved again, south, always south. But Ellen didn't make it. He made sure of it. The line cuts, no name, no trace. Still, the truth hasn't surfaced yet. The word South echoes in the detective's mind. South Chicago, South suburbs, or farther, south across state lines. He spreads maps again, pins stretching like veins. He follows transport routes, warehouses, old Syndicate fronts. The trail fans out, endless, impossible. But one pattern holds. Each move was tied to Friday. A cycle of relocation, a ritual of deception, promises made, never kept. Fridays became the Patterson family's curse. The detective drives to Halstead Bridge one last time. The river moves slow, heavy, as if dragging the past along its bed. He stands there in the dark, whispering their names, listening for echoes in the water. All he hears is the current. Still, the real story hadn't even begun, because no bodies have been found. No graves, no final proof, Only fragments, drawings on walls, Polaroids in trunks, jackets in lockers, cassettes whispering into the void. Evidence of lives prolonged, cut short, prolonged again. A story without an ending because the ending was buried too deep, moved too many times. The detective pins the final artifacts to his board, steps back and feels the weight crush him. Ellen's voice on tape, Joey's jacket, Mel's handprint in ash. Together they scream louder than silence, but silence still wins, because no one can say what happened after 1994. And you're left asking, were the Patterson children executed quietly, their graves hidden beneath concrete and lies, or did someone finally take pity, spiriting them away into lives lived under new names, always looking over their shoulders, never coming home? State secret or a syndicate curse? Tell us in the comments, because some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish, they keep them alive with us.